I've been part of this for at least 6 years, kind of leading our team for the last 3 during Infrastructure Weeklies. I think this is the first Infrastructure Week event I've ever been to where the terms concentrated poverty were used, engaging community, funding flows at a local level is often talked about, but the way we talked about it was different. And this is the exact kind of outcomes I think we wanted to have from this event, is to note that infrastructure, federal funding flows, federal legislation, public-private partnerships, which we also talked about here today, they're all essential. But we also have to put people at the middle of these conversations as our motivation. So a huge thank you to the past panelists, and especially the 2 moderators for keeping our conversation going. This is the exact kind of outcomes we wanted to have today. So this panel is explicitly about technology, although that's really such a cumbersome term. We're really talking about digital technology here, to be explicit. And we have an amazing set of panelists that have joined us. So I'm actually going to go from this end this way. So all the way opposite from me is Angela Seifer, who's the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Angela is one of the most tireless advocates for the importance of connecting digital tech to people and making sure that they have an opportunity to benefit from it. She has over 20 years of experience in this sector. She's worked at the local level, at the federal level, and is building an incredible community of practice with local constituents all over the country. So we are really, really humbled to have Angela in from Ohio today with us. Next to her, to stay with our almost exclusive Midwest theme until we get to Shoshana for the whole day, and a lot of Minnesota today too, is Tom Schenk, who's the Chief Data Officer for the City of Chicago. You're going to hear a lot about Chicago's incredible programming that they've been doing recently, but that's really just scraping the surface of what Tom's experience is here. His depth of scholarship, of network building with his fellow kind of CDOs, and past work across a range of topics is really, really impressive, and you're going to hear it in the way he frames his comments today. So we are really humbled also to have Tom join us here from the city of Chicago. And then finally, to Tom's right, we have Shoshana Liu, who in full transparency, is a former colleague of ours at the Brookings Metro program. Although many years ago, and many more degrees in the rings of the circle of her, in a tree metaphor of her career. Shoshana, over the prior to the last year, 8 years before that, during the prior federal administration here, is really a model of how to build a successful career with impact in our community. So both as Chief Financial Officer, working on emission standards for trucking, working at on finance through building the new financial related bureau inside the USDOT. Shoshana has made a real impact in our communities, and now she is the Chief Operating Officer of the Ocean State, Rhode Island. And so we're going to hear a lot about the innovations happening there. So before we jump in, I just want to stress what we're looking at here. We're looking at both a mix of federal experience, state experience, currently working at the state, currently working at the city level, currently working at the civic level. And so all of these kind of are critical components in how we can make sure that digital technology, both those infrastructure investments, but also the programming around it, helps build a more inclusive economy for all. So here's what I want to toss out to the panel so you can get a chance to know them a little bit, the softball, and then we'll get into more questions. So what are the core challenges and opportunities that exist in each of the spaces that you tend to work in? Let's start with you, Angela.
So I feel like the new kid on the block.
Oh, the microphone, too.
I'm just used to shouting at people. I'm definitely feeling like the new kid on the block, right? Because I want to talk about broadband. And I was looking at our neat little icons up there for Infrastructure Week, and nobody's talking about broadband, which is essential to do all these awesome things where we want to engage people, maybe social media. We need infrastructure of broadband kind, right? So challenges with that. It's urban and rural, right? So misconception that it's only a rural problem. And that's because we need both speed that makes us ready for the future, not speed that makes us ready for today. And also, we need it to be affordable. Digital redlining is real. We have data from a provider that shows us digital redlining is real, right? That there is not investment in poor neighborhoods. So there are neighborhoods where you can't get the speeds you need because there was not an investment, because we don't regulate broadband, right? We really don't. Nobody's in charge. So those are kind of the big things. And then what Adi mentioned, the wrap around the programming of that is that Once we build it, we need to make sure everybody has skills, digital literacy skills, and the right devices. And the infrastructure itself, that broadband needs to be in people's homes. Public access is insufficient. Okay, I'm going to pass it on.
So my role at the City of Chicago is to direct our teams to use data to improve the quality of life and improve the efficiency of city operations. And that cuts across a lot of different ways. One, what Angela just said is absolutely true and something that we do see in Chicago. We do see the digital redlining that does occur. We see broad different uses of what type of devices people are able to access on a day-to-day basis. Some people are only really accessing broadband internet through their phones. If you can imagine trying to do your homework that way, that's your sole source of information. Well, yes, you can access broadband. That's not a sufficient way to be able to access a lot of information and resources that's necessary to be able to participate in school. But beyond that, that sort of digital access is important for being able to achieve what we need to do from the data perspective. One, we need to, of course, need to be able to treat data as an asset, make it available to everybody. And we do that within our own city employees, make it widely available, but we also do that for the public. You can go to data portals, which are quite popular these days across a number of different cities. Chicago is one of the first, where you can go and you can download data ranging from every single crime that's occurred in the city of Chicago to every permit that has been issued, to every single salary employee and the salary that they make who work for the city of Chicago, to every single taxi trip ever taken in the city of Chicago for the last 3 or 4 years. And then a lot of everything in between, where the roads are at, a bunch of maps of what is all built throughout the city of Chicago. So as you talk about infrastructure, where's the infrastructure at? Well, where's the data at for that? And this is something that we make broadly available through our data portal sites. And then we also use things such as predictive analytics to predict what's going to happen across the city. When we talk about aging infrastructure, one of the problems that we have is, of course, lead paint poisoning. Children who are under 2 years old who ingest lead paint. That's costly. It can cost between 10 and 40 IQ points off of that child, depending on the length and severity of the exposure. That's a normal childhood, a childhood where that's 100 IQ, be able to comfortably graduate from high school, go to college, to a livelihood that's going to be very difficult for that child, for the parents, with a very different life outcome. So we built predictive analytic models, and an example about which kids are most likely to succumb to lead paint poisoning, and offering up free services so hospitals can sign up for free and get predictions. As their patients come through, we can inform them that a child have elevated likelihood of getting lead paint poisoning. To other projects, too, about being able to connect people with digital services. And of course, I'm going to pull this out because it's one of my favorite projects that we've worked on lately. But this is the City of Chicago. It's called City Key. It's a municipal ID card. I'm going to cover that up for the camera right there so you can't quite see everything. This ID card that you have here is something that you can use to access the CTA buses, the trains, the regional trains throughout the city, the commuter trains throughout the city. It's your library card. You can use it to access city services. If a police officer pulls you over or stops you for something that is benign, you can show them this ID card, and it's your proof of identification. You're not going to get locked up because you don't have an immediate identification on you. All you need to do is prove residency within the city of Chicago to be able to hold on to this. Permanent residency within the United States is besides the point with this particular ID card, but it's also completely protected. There's actually no database showing that I'm holding on to this card right now, but it's also designed to work with all of our city systems. So this is a way that we can think about how to use technology to connect people with services, maintain their privacy, but also provide a broad value that's useful for everybody throughout the city of Chicago, so they want to use that card. So I'll stop there and I'll pass it on.
Thank you. And I am going to take us back to transportation for a moment. Unusual for that to be the outlier during Infrastructure Week. From the perspective of a state transportation department, we sort of deal with technology challenges in kind of two different vectors. The first, how it interfaces with the infrastructure itself, the mobile source technology that uses the infrastructure, the people who use it to move. The second, how we kind of deal with technology for the purposes of our internal planning and the way that we make decisions in ways that sort of serve the public interest. To take the first, we in Rhode Island, like many other states and cities across the country, are thinking about how kind of changes in transportation technology, be it the development of autonomy and vehicle technology, new methods of ride sharing that sort of challenge our conventions of how people get around, even traffic light technology sort of interface with people. And we, over the past year or so, have been really going through a concerted effort to ask ourselves big questions about how we think about those impacts. And we've come to some sort of human-centered themes that I'll talk about just briefly. The first is that we really have to think about how these technologies affect sort of placemaking goals and people. The technology is not itself, an ends, but rather a means to achieving certain goals. And thinking about how we kind of deliberately employ new kinds of technology for moving people in places that fill gaps and make communities better is not something that is going to just happen. The second is thinking about the kind of workforce and employment implications. And, thinking about autonomy is a good example because it could change, take the example of what a bus driver does. There are still going to be humans interfacing with public transportation, as the way that the kind of mode exists changes, but probably the kinds of jobs that people will need to be prepared for in 10, 20, 30 years could change. And getting ahead of how we train people to be part of the transportation workforce of the future is something that we are thinking about very actively now. And a third that I'll just hit on kind of in that vein is the kind of environmental and climate goals as they play out in this space. There is a sort of tendency to think about new innovative technologies as being better for the environment, a tendency to think of autonomy and electrification in the same breath. That could be, it is not necessarily the case. And again, it's a space where we have to think about, how we are trying to achieve these ends and how we sort of steer them in a way that complements. The second vector that I'll talk about just briefly is how we sort of go through internal processes in a way that makes decisions that kind of have the human impacts that we seek to achieve. We at the Rhode Island Department of Transportation have gone through a very sort of systemic set of reforms over the past few years to take on an asset management approach to planning. And that is, instead of just doing a piecemeal project because someone says they want it, you sort of think about the system as a whole. And make very educated, data-driven decisions about where the sort of needs the ability for a project to kind of, live out and maximize its utility for a certain period of time, and the kind of different impacts, whether that's safety, access, or otherwise, sort of interplay with one another. That is heavily reliant on technology and sort of building the internal infrastructure that you need to make that work. There are a great number of sort of software packages that make that possible that we are working to sort of deploy and integrate with one another. And there is also, I think, an ability to think differently about how we sort of use the technology to sort of fill gaps in the vein of inclusion. And, just one quick example that I will close with here is that, I was part of a meeting a month or two ago where we were talking about getting stakeholder feedback. And, someone raised the point that there was a sort of disparity in who was attending the listening sessions that they were having. And, expressing some concern that the listening sessions were not sufficiently inclusive and, gathering the range of stakeholders whom they wanted. And, I posed the question, could we use technology to kind of help us use data to sort of overlay where the anchor institutions, the other, sort of parts of the community that help people connect with one another are at. And, instead of saying, how do we get more people to come to listening sessions, can we use data to make sure that we're sort of thinking equitably across the system? And, I think to the conversation we had in the past panel, there are always going to be sort of challenges in getting people to the table in kind of the same ways. And in some ways, we can use data that's gathered through technology to bridge some of those gaps.
Yeah, great. So let me toss out to all of you, and thank you for the background there. I think you all started to touch on some of the objectives we want to achieve here, right? But I think what's commenting across all three of these panels is the idea of inclusion is really putting people at the center, right? It's not about just the infrastructure for infrastructure's sake. It's about achieving some kind of very explicit human-centric outcomes, right? So I know both mics are down here, so I'm going to let you all fight over who wants to jump in here first. Ideally, you kind of can go in any order you want. But what are those kind of core human-centric objectives you want to see? Let me almost say it in a slightly different way, right? What does a better world look like, right? Let's say 5, 10 years right down the road, based on your specific kind of sectors of expertise, and ideally how they kind of integrate with one another too.
So one of the ways that people are, of course, using to interact with their cities is technology. That can be as simple as websites or applications where you're looking up when the bus is going to arrive, when things are going to be open, when is something going to shut. Get a notification that your you should move your car because we're going to be sweeping the streets, and so you want to move that so we don't ticket or tow you. So these sort of things are more commonly how people are anticipating and expecting to interact with us, let alone more narrowly defined constituents such as businesses and others who are filing permits with us, but those are narrow. And at the same time, people are using technology and other means of technology to be able to commute across the city, to be able to transport across the city. So as we've regulated new industries such as ride sharing and others, we have a dockless bike pilot that's launching in the south side of Chicago this summer. We're trying to collect more data about those services as they're being offered so we can coordinate those services across the entire spectrum. So as you're reaching out to this application using this service and not the CTA, as you're interacting with us, A, that there is actually technological infrastructure for you to interact with, and then B, we're using data behind the scenes to be able to coordinate those activities, to plan better, to see where it is. To bring it back to transportation, as Shoshana mentioned earlier, when I take a look at the data that we're collecting within the city, the largest growth area is in the transportation sector. With the growing number of companies offering different services and options, we're seeing more data being collected there than anywhere else. We take a look at rideshare companies, for instance. Rideshares roughly outnumber taxi cab trips 4 to 5 to 1 at this point. It's getting quite disproportional. So that information is quite important to us as we're trying to coordinate our services. And of course, we're, as some people know, we're taxing some of these new services, such as rideshare companies, to be able to help fund improvements to the CTA, to our transit systems, so we can make sure that there's improved systems across the entire city and there's a good amount of equity across the city.
I often get asked, so what data is there to show that it's important for everybody to have access to the internet? That really kind of makes me mad. Yeah. Like, well, is it important for you to have access to the internet? Is it important for your kids to have access to the internet? So I think the data point more has to do with the programs themselves, right? So how are we getting folks access to the internet? That's what we want to measure, those, because which ones of those are successful and should be replicated? Because the end result of that is the technology, but it's what people are doing with the technology, and what they're doing with it is so varied. And so it's really hard to measure, like if you're measuring, did someone's economic life improve because of access to the internet or digital skills? And then it turns out, no, it didn't, but now they have a better relationship with their kid's teacher. Well, we weren't measuring relationships for education. We were measuring economic. So the impact is so wide that it's almost kind of silly to try to narrow it down. But what we can measure is, are those programs successful? And being able to get at the best ways to roll out low-cost, high-speed infrastructure everywhere, and to look at the specific policies that influence that.
Yeah, I actually want to stay with you for a second, Angela, because this is really important, and you're exactly right. It's not only not talked about enough today, going to other sessions, it's normally not. We just assume it. To some, and I think what Tom was saying was right, but like talk about some of the points, even just let's say like through the lens of dockless bike share, right? And some of us were like, it's a nuisance on our sidewalk. But think about all the, because you speak to kind of how digital skills can go into something. It doesn't necessarily be dockless bike share, right? That's obvious on banking, let's say, but all the elements we need to be digitally connected that are related to digital skills, right?
Right. So like banking is a good example. How much time does it save any of us to do online banking? I love online banking because I don't have to get myself to the bank to deposit checks or whatever it is I need to do. But if you don't have that and the bank isn't right around the corner, then transportation works in, right? Because then you got to figure out how to get to the bank, and you just waste all that time getting to the bank when you could have done it at home. So there's different examples of how people use it, and it not only wastes their time and energy, it's also the time and energy of the bank, right? That they have to have people in those locations. But then the data collection is also wrapped into that, because if we're making decisions based upon data, but we don't have data from everyone, because if you have a data cap on your phone, do you care to give the city or anybody else any information? No, because you're saving that for when you really, really have to have it for emergencies, because you only have half a meg on your phone, and otherwise you only use it when there's free Wi-Fi. Right, so a good example I heard was local government had set up some data collection where residents were voluntarily telling them where there were problems with certain intersections. Well, all the problems, the high data points came back in the wealthier neighborhoods. What, there's no problems with intersections in poor neighborhoods? No, they just didn't, those folks just weren't participating in this particular data collection.
All right, well, I will start like a transportation person and say safety first. But I think the kind of challenge of what that means in a world of changing technology looks different than the way we sort of typically think about it in the world of the Federal Highway Administration regulating the size and shape of stop signs. I think with sort of different kinds of assets using roads, bridges, trains, etc., you have a challenge of kind of integrating different kinds of technology in the same space. We think about that a great deal, not only in the sort of world of autonomy, but even with the kind of technologies that are in people's cars changing. This week we have a hands-free law going into effect in Rhode Island. We are behind the curve, and thankfully we have this in place now, but it just, I think, underscores the imminent challenges that we have as people start to use different kinds of digital technology while they are moving about in the transportation network, and particularly as people are adapting to kinds of technologies that they weren't used to while using sort of very dangerous means. It creates something that has to be dealt with right now. I would also say in the kind of safety vein that using the kind of data-driven decision-making tools that I was talking about before has substantial safety and equity implications. There is a tendency to, again, think about the kinds of infrastructure investments that support equity as being the ones that are typically the placemakers, the new, the innovative ones. Actually, it is often the kind of state of good repair type work that can have really significant impact. We had a sort of fascinating but troubling trend before the current governor of Rhode Island. There was a year where we spent more money on bike paths than on the interstate. In one sense, for the changes in modal shift, sounds great. What that meant is that sort of across the state there were critical state of good repair projects, lots of bridges, lots of them in poorer communities that were being neglected. And making sure that we're sort of not just taking the shiny object, but using the information that we have to sort of protect people equally and making sure that they have the means to get around, I think is very important. The two other sort of things that I would point to, building on the comment that I made before. The first is making sure that we have a way to kind of think measurably about economic impact and what that means. A lot of the models that we have to sort of do a cost-benefit analysis on a project with respect to economic impacts in particular are not very good. They're rough. There is opportunity for refinement, and people just don't think that critically about how to do it and how to kind of take the things that we know impact people and put it into a model that you don't have to be the expert to employ. And I think there's a lot of sort of opportunity to improve the way we make decisions in that space. And finally, I would just point to the sort of obvious looming concern about resiliency and sort of thinking about what a changing climate means for our infrastructure assets and how we make investments that will continue to be relevant in the years out and sort of continue to have the kind of connecting effects that they need.
Right, and that point connects to stuff that's been said, especially on the first panel with regards to resiliency, and also asked on that panel is this kind of element of performance measurement. So let me just toss out: do you all feel in the communities you work in, across jurisdictional lines, that there's alignment on those objectives? Are people working in the same direction? And when they're not, how does that cause problems, right? Even to your point, Angela, you talked about in certain neighborhoods, and Tom, you confirmed it, right, on the digital redlining, right? How much do even at the city or county level do they know it's happening, right? And they're deeply concerned about it. Yeah.
I can start with an example that I think is a success story. I mentioned at the beginning that we had a serious wholesale change of the way that we make decisions in our department about 2-3 years ago now. Which was very driven by kind of working towards a goal of achieving 90% bridge structural sufficiency by 2025. It does not sound like the sexiest goal, but when you have the worst bridges in the country, that's what you got to do.
Right.
And the effort that it took to rally people across the state around that goal was Herculean. Most of it was actually before I got there. But what's been remarkable about it, and very much supported by data and the way that we do analytics, is that it's been sustained. And it kind of gives you a way to make hard choices if you are working towards a goal like that. That one, in some ways, never miss a good crisis. It gives you there's a statutory mandate to have 90% structural bridge sufficiency. It is kind of obvious from a movement perspective that you need it, but it is very hard to kind of keep people focused on a goal like that, and having clear metrics that people are bought into and where you can kind of monitor performance and sort of keep dollars steered in that direction, I think has a tremendous impact, and there's real opportunity to kind of use that model and move forward with it.
Yeah.
In broadband infrastructure world, the most common goals is the physical infrastructure available at a particular speed. FCC is currently saying 25 down 3 meg up. But then the next measurement is how many of those folks how many of your community members have broadband in their homes consistently in their homes, not just when they can afford it. So that is a number that is strikingly of concern, right? That the infrastructure might be there, but folks aren't subscribing to it because it's too expensive. We used to say that we thought there was a barrier of relevance. Folks don't see the value, so they don't sign up. That is quickly becoming a very small barrier. When you ask, do you subscribe to the internet, and somebody says no, and you say why, the answer most common is I can't afford it. So that is the measurement that we have. In the UK, they measure digital skills. We haven't gotten there yet. We're still trying to make sure folks have internet at home. But we will get there, right? Like, it's not the kind of thing we can just wait until later to make sure everybody has the skills. So I suspect very soon we'll start to see that wrapping into our conversations.
Obviously, equity is a significant concern within a city, especially a very large metropolitan area like Chicago and the core city of Chicago. And when we work with technology, we work with data, we're usually working with another department to achieve their ends and to be able to round that out to be a useful product. So, for instance, the city of Chicago is replacing all of our streetlights, replacing them with smart streetlights that are going to be connected with our 311 and 911 system. So as a 911 call comes in, for instance, in a car crash, during the middle of the night, we will automatically raise the brightness of those lights so first responders can see those scenes earlier. But also getting feedback from people, making sure that ambiently that these things aren't too bright to begin with, because a lot of people care about the color temperature and all of that stuff. So these are things to help achieve ends, and ultimately a lot of people want to be able to have these nice new things in their neighborhood. Except we have to be careful sometimes, especially a lot about smart city technology. If we only go into communities of color or underserved communities, however you want to define that, with sensor-based technologies, things that contain cameras, that could appear that we're, in fact, picking on those communities, trying to surveil those communities, when in fact that's not the intention of that. So we always need to talk with folks, talk with community organizations that exist there, that have the pre-existing relationships, to understand how they're going to perceive some of these new technologies and these new approaches. Because despite our best intentions, it could be perceived wrongly and not what we were trying to get at in the first place, and that caused a lot more political heartache than it needed to in the first place, because we didn't reach out early on to get feedback on a plan and thought.
Can I build on that with one further point? I think you're hitting on a really critical point with respect to the utility of performance measures, which is that you kind of have to know what you're doing with the information before you collect it. And sort of collecting metrics just for the sake of collecting metrics is not useful. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of taxpayer dollars in many of our cases. And it can be perceived as quite intrusive if there isn't kind of a clear goal to which people are bought in and a reason why you're collecting it. And I think we've pointed to some examples of real success in collecting data to help us manage towards goals. There are also examples that don't work as well. I will briefly pick on a program I used to work with closely. I think if you look at the way performance measures were employed in some of the early years of the Tiger program, they were very well intentioned, but there were these sort of project by project goals that were built into specific applications by the urging of the transportation department. And what resulted from it was a set of data that was not streamlined across projects, much less programs, and it didn't actually do a whole lot of good in terms of management. And I think that was something that was corrected in the later years of the program, but it's an example of why you have to be sort of holistic and goal-oriented in the way that you collect and manage the information, and not just sort of do it because it seems like a good idea to have data points.
Right, totally. I want to stay on this I want to go up on the idea of both management and collaboration, and it would be, I'd be remiss if we don't ask about Washington when we're in Washington. Is Washington here to help? And let me not just try to be like provocative with it. I'm saying like that, meaning do you feel like Washington hears the issues that you hear in your communities, right? So often to try to set it up here, my pet peeve on this is we talk so much about on autonomous vehicles, thinking about the safety design, really essential. How are we going to make sure it rolls out to all people, that these digital gaps can connect with them? So that's just one point, right? But on that, do you feel like Washington hears the issues that you need and they have programming out there to help you get at those objectives you've all been showing some commonalities on?
No. No. In terms of digital equity, there is still not an understanding that we don't. That's a thing. That there's a problem. If you and everybody that you know has something, do you think about people who don't have that thing? Right? So everybody you know has a phone, right? I was told recently somebody in a leader of a tech think tank here in DC had a large event, and she made a joke about everybody having phones. Most people have phones, but not everybody has phones, and even if you do have a phone, you might have a crappy data plan. So how we use those phones varies a lot. The term digital native kind of also, lots of things make me angry. I should have started with that. Being a digital native doesn't necessarily mean that you have the digital skills to be successful professionally. You might be really good at Snapchat. My 17-year-old is really good at Snapchat. Would I want her to create a spreadsheet for me? No, I would not. I actually did have her friends help me with a spreadsheet one time, and it was disastrous. I thought they knew how to use it, and they don't. So being a digital native doesn't mean you have skills to be in a job, right? So no, DC right now, there's a misunderstanding of what we need. There's a misunderstanding of kind of what's out there. Also, it's really important to note, internet service providers are really powerful. They have really, really big lobbying arms. So the needs of the communities are not getting the same attention in the offices of our elected officials as the needs of the internet service providers. Internet service providers are really important. I don't want any of them to be mad at me. They're really important, but they also will acknowledge they go in and they state their case about what they need. The rest of us don't go in and state our case about what we need in terms of internet access. Right? I mean, that happens in lots of fields, but it definitely happens in this field. So I think it's the fact that we don't regulate broadband at all. I mean, it really should be a utility, right? It's not, and not in the U.S. It means that when decisions are made by the providers, they're made for their bottom line, and we should just all be like, "Hey, that's the way it is." Right? Why do we pretend that that's not the way it is? But we do actually kind of pretend that's not the way it is. And then we end up with areas that are digitally redlined, and they're like, gee, I can't believe that this happened. Well, it's because their interests are not the interests of the community. Like, we don't need to beat them over the head about it. We just need to state the facts.
And I knew you were going to ask that. I specifically want to ask, too, because so many of us use federal data, right? How often do you find federal data resources? And in particular, are there federal programs that help you staff up, right? So you can be responsive to your community, but do they hear what you need, right, to do that?
So this is something that we've lost. There's Chicago, we have a lot of tiffs right now with the current federal administration, and those have played out in the press. But to focus on the technology and data side, one, federal data sources have been tremendously important to us. A lot of what we do wouldn't exist. We wouldn't know what our communities look like in a data-informed way without the census. And so a lot of this has been scaled back, even in previous legislation where we've gone from a rich 10-year census to very watered-down 10-year census. And this matters a lot because it's getting harder and harder to understand at smaller geographic communities across different segments of folks what's happening around Chicago, and that is hurting us. One of the things that we did this past year when EPA took down their climate change data, this was a big, or the climate change website, this was a big deal for us. So we captured that and we reposted it online on our webpage, and 24 other cities also doing the same, to amplify that if data is going to go missing, if information is going to go away, we're going to amplify that noise about it going away. And what you're seeing from us on the city side do more and more is peer collaboration. It's been talked about before today, in particular ways that data that's been done in the data realm is that the chief data officers, we've banded together, we've created our own group based out of Harvard Kennedy School, where we meet on a regular basis. In fact, I'm actually missing the in-person meeting that we do twice a year. And we talk on the phone every single month. So when you look at chief data officer and these heads of data, heads of analytics that you're seeing throughout the cities, these are new disciplines. There was no textbook on this. We're coming into this fresh and new, so we need to learn rather rapidly. And oftentimes we're learning from others because somebody else may have already tackled the project and we can simply adapt that. And we also have the technological resources to be able to share more efficiently and effectively. For instance, one of the projects that City of Chicago did early on when I was there and when I was appointed there was to predict, it's not infrastructure related, but to predict where which restaurant was going to fail their food inspection and to allocate our food inspectors to that location. Well, we took that source code that we did to create that model, we posted it online, and other people have adapted that. Other projects have gone down the same way. This summer, we're working on a project where we're going to work with code that was developed by San Francisco, New York City, and Seattle to predict where fatal traffic accidents were most likely to occur, so we can better coordinate and plan and proactively respond to where we think things are going to happen. So the technological infrastructure is there. We can obviously communicate. We can share code easier, and that has allowed us to learn through peer networks to help try to make up for some of the information and data and processes and mentorship that we have lost from the federal agency side.
I think transportation is sort of an interesting space to answer this question, and because, as many of you know, it's an area where, certainly on the East Coast, most of the dollars are federal. Most of the kind of project level decisions are state with some local, and kind of how you maximize the value of the roles that those different entities play in making decisions is an area where there could be a lot of optimization using kind of each role strategically, which I think sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't, and is often more driven by kind of inertia at agencies than anyone's political agenda. I think the question of how you kind of set the standards at the federal level so that you get the information and kind of prompt the kinds of decision making you want to happen without being sort of heavy-handed about how the city of X makes its decisions about which road needs to be fixed first, is an area with a lot of opportunity. There are kind of control mechanisms through the money stream that could, if fully achieved, have a lot of impact. One that I worked on quite closely when I was at the federal level was the implementation of the Data Act, which sort of grew on the heels of the Recovery Act information, tracking information, to kind of get a better sense of where dollars are going with an eye towards human impact. Done right, there's a tremendous potential to kind of use the requirements at the federal level to track certain kinds of information about dollar flow from top to bottom, and kind of use that to make better decisions. It's very hard to do. It's never been funded. The Data Act was passed as an unfunded mandate and has never been able to be sort of fully implemented, in the way that would probably achieve that because of money. The USA Spending, which is the website that is sort of supposed to do that, has never been populated with the kinds of information to make it the kind of tool I think those of us who care about it would want to be, because it just doesn't have the cache of information. But to take the microcosm of the Recovery Act dollars, it was imperfect. It was a kind of pilot in many ways, but there's a tremendous trove of information about sort of where those dollars went, where you can sort of see the potential for what that would be able to do if you had it at scale and if you had it consistently over years and decades, so that you could really see where dollars are going. At the state and local level, a lot of that information is collected, but it's sufficiently hard to make decisions about how you collect it that I actually think that achievable guidance with resources would be helpful. I look at my own agency, an experience I had yesterday. I was told that it was difficult to tie our own planning information to our own project management information because a year ago, someone had neglected to put a unique identifier code. Like, my head practically exploded. I said, like, we're getting together, and this problem will be solved in a month. Like, we don't have that many projects in Rhode Island. It's doable. But, there's a world where the Data Act, if implemented the way it was supposed to be, would have solved that problem from the outset so that nobody would be having to make those decisions alone.
That's great. Karen's already looked at me. We need to have questions. Is that right? Right. Yeah, that'd be good. Okay. So I'm done asking, so you all can ask. We've got at least a few minutes left. I'm going to keep looking at Karen. So let's at least, how much time do we have left?
2 minutes.
Oh, okay. So let's do this. We're going to take at least, raise your hands. I'm going to try to take 2 questions. The standard Brookings thing that we ask. Please just, whatever you're going to say, just end it in a question mark, right? It's meant to be a question, not just a comment. You can come up to them after and ask make your commentary if you want then. But whoever wants to ask something on the panel. Okay, let's go right here. We'll go back there first. And please announce who you are, Tim.
Hi, I'm Wendy Cloncher. I'm with the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, and I work with people with disabilities and low-income communities. And my question is about autonomous vehicles, TNC, app-based services for low-income people and for people with visual disabilities who maybe can't use the kind of apps, or for people who are excited about autonomous vehicles but don't know if they're going to be built in a way where people with wheelchairs can get in them. What are you seeing as some of the ways in which those issues are being addressed today among researchers and in your own agencies and regions?
So within the city of Chicago, part of the mandatory data reporting requirements that come to the city is reporting people reaching out, and I'll have to say in particular around physical disabilities of wheelchair access. And so taxi cabs in the city of Chicago have long offered those services, special hotlines, and specifically designed vehicles to be able to deliver that. And there's been a lot of debate there, and that's probably still imperfect. And we've been using that data to help enforce for the TNCs or the rideshare companies to be able to better enforce whether or not those needs are being adequately met throughout the community. And we're actually in active conversations right now using that data to approach companies and saying how can we work together to improve that. But if you look at the generation of the applications that they've been used in Chicago, a lot of that information was buried about how you can even access these wheelchair accessible vehicles. And just by using the application, just trying to better surface that up closer and closer to the front, so it's on parity with being able to access these services like you would in the normal app has been important for us. So using data to help improve that. However, I will say other forms of physical impairment that you talked about, we have not stressed as much lately, and we've mostly been stressing on the wheelchair accessible vehicles.
I think one area where sort of nationwide we're seeing a lot of really positive trending is on the collaboration that's starting to happen between TNCs and other forms of mobility and the healthcare community. I mean, there is a lot of really interesting work going on that kind of pairs medical services to, connecting people with a ride based on data that shows that people's ability to access the healthcare they need is often inhibited by proper transportation access. And I think that seems like it's sort of a model for how you can cut across some of these jurisdictions when you're thinking about the technology side of it and the sort of human impact side, particularly with respect to, dealing with challenges in the mobility space, but also, some of these services will actually take some of the steps out of the TNC, for the person who is using the access. I think one of the areas that I would also point to, this is not in Rhode Island, but in our neighbor to the north, Boston has done some very interesting piloting of taking some of their paratransit services and seeing if you could use a kind of Uber-Lyft-like model to replace traditional paratransit. They're finding tremendous cost savings, but also the people like it. Instead of having to book the service, 48 hours in advance to have the cab, they can use Uber and have a Uber come in the time frame any of us could as well. So I think that there's lots of challenges to implementation, whether it's the sort of liability issues associated with it, the scaling up, making sure that the workforce is kind of sufficient to be able to cater to the need that it could create. But you can see how that could really transform mobility options and help people, be active in ways and for periods of time that might not be possible otherwise.
Yeah. I would just quickly add myself that the unbanked issue, though, really comes into play here because it connects to that digital record keeping, even if they have a smartphone, let's say, right? So let's go to this last question here, and I think we're going to wrap it for the day.
Hi, I'm Danielle Duran. I'm a former city councilor from a very rural, poor area, but I live here in DC now. And just following up on the DC question, or how can Washington be helpful? Yesterday, I was at the meeting of the new Smart Cities Caucus that's led by Representatives Issa and Clark. And one of the points that was made was that everybody will need digital skills. Everybody needs to know some amount of cyber. Everybody needs to know some amount of coding for almost every job in the future. And that includes our Congress. So do you have any thoughts about digital skills for Congress and what they need in order to make informed, good policy decisions?
Now that's how you close an event. Thank you.
There are still people, elected officials, whose assistants or secretaries print out their emails for them. How can they make decisions about the technology that the rest of us need if they don't use the technology? Right? Yeah. So there is a movement now around technology public policy to educate policymakers. There are multiple programs along this line. We have to have them understanding, and so there's this big education gap. I am super excited about the potential for smart city movement. It's kind of sexy, right? Smart cities, right? Digital equity, I think it's cool, but not a lot of other people do. But there's an overlap. In the smart city movement, there is a growing recognition that we can't have smart cities for just some people. How smart are we if only some of our folks have access to these cool new tools? That it is for everybody. And then that gets the folks who are working on smart city initiatives to also look at, does everybody have broadband at home? Does everybody know how to use it? Do they have the right device? Because as mentioned, a mobile phone is not the right device for every task. So there's an opportunity there. So I'm excited to hear that there's a caucus. Yeah, and would love to chat with you some more. Because right now, most of those solutions are really local. So, because, they're not federal. But they are local, and that's exciting. And so there's that clear opportunity for there to be more local solutions because there's already excitement around smart cities.
Obviously, to legislate this, to enact policy around this, you need to have some substantive understanding of what's going to happen at the end of the day. We've seen that within cities as they've started to appoint chief data officers. Cities have been able to better interpret policy and be able to better interpret data and use that towards policy ends. To the same extent, it's frustrating if you're working with a policy maker who does not understand the fundamentals of that technology, does not understand how it can be used, what's really capable versus not capable. Data and technology in general is a black box. It is technical, it's hard to understand. So without that knowledge and understanding, it's going to be harder and harder for that to come from the federal level, and you're going to see more and more cities, states, and counties banding together to try to substitute in for that, banding together, trying to advise on these sort of issues.
Well, I'll be a bit of a contrarian just for the heck of it. Why not? I think it is there is sort of a basic threshold question about how we educate everybody in a way where they'll be able to use technology in a way that interaction with the modern world will be possible. I also think that as we think about how we deploy technology into what ends, there's always a question of meeting people where they're at in the kind of disciplines in which they've grown up in ways where it will be sort of meaningful to them in the context in which they're working. And not the same as policymakers, but an example we have is helping people who are in the field doing construction oversight to use an iPad. One of the things, we're just in the process of doing this, the record keeping, like some of the ones you've been talking about, has been on note cards for, longer than I've been born. And one of the questions is, what software package do you use that is meant for somebody who has grown up in that culture to be able to learn how to use it? And actually there is a software package where the target audience is considered to not necessarily have had a lot of data background, but where, it's kind of in the way that, an iPhone is supposed to cater to being a two-year-old intuitive, which actually seems to be demonstrably the case. This program is designed so that if you are sort of acculturated to the, terms of art and the way that decisions are made in this field, it makes sense to you. And I think some of the burden is on the people who make the technology to make it usable to different constituencies.
That's a great way to close. And the thought that hit me was when not to throw him under the bus, but when Senator Hatch asked the question of the Zuckerberg computer, of how he can survive, and he actually showed some emotion. He says, "We sell ads. What are you talking about, man?" So I think it's all come home to us all across the country, seeing what the discrepancies are here when we have different knowledge levels. First, join me in thanking the panel for taking all the time to sit with us here today, And honestly, a huge thank you to all of you for both joining us, for sticking it through. Enjoy the rest of Infrastructure Week. There's some amazing programming that's not just going on the rest of the week, more programming today. In fact, you can go probably find lunch somewhere for free. So there is a lot of stuff happening in DC. So enjoy this time thinking about these topics, and we hope this helps you out a little bit.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.